Jake Morrison's hands were black with grease and grime as he tightened the last bolt on the cooling system. Another 14-hour shift in the belly of Velthora was finally coming to an end. The alien city stretched above him like a mountain of metal and glass, filled with creatures from 100 different worlds. Some had scales, some had fur, and some were just clouds of gas held together by force fields. Jake was used to all of it by now. He had been working these maintenance tunnels for almost 2 years, keeping the city's guts running while everyone else lived their lives up above. He wiped his hands on his already dirty coveralls and checked his watch. 7:30 in the evening, station time. The markets would be closing soon, and if he hurried he might catch old Brennan at the food stall before he packed up. Jake's stomach growled at the thought of something hot to eat. The ration bars in his locker were getting old fast. The maintenance tunnels were quiet this time of night. Most of the other workers had clocked out hours ago. Jake liked it that way. The silence gave him time to think, time to breathe. Up on Earth he had been nobody special. Just another guy working dead-end jobs watching life pass him by. But out here, in the stars, he was keeping an entire section of an alien city running. It wasn't much, but it was something. He was climbing the ladder toward street level when he heard it. A sound so small and pitiful that he almost missed it over the hum of the city's machinery. It sounded like crying. Like something tiny and helpless was in pain. Jake froze on the ladder, listening. There it was again. A whimpering sound mixed with cruel laughter. His jaw tightened. He knew that sound. Bullies sounded the same no matter what planet you were on. Jake pulled himself up through the maintenance hatch and into the alley. The evening lights of Velthora cast everything in shades of purple and blue. The smell of alien food vendors mixed with the metallic scent of the city's recycled air. And there, about 30 feet down the narrow space between two massive buildings, he saw them. 3 small creatures huddled together against the wall. Their scales caught the light like precious stones, shimmering with colors Jake didn't even have names for. They had tiny wings pressed tight against their bodies, and their eyes were wide with terror. Each one was no bigger than a house cat, delicate and fragile looking. Standing over them were 3 aliens that Jake recognized as Grullions. Big reptilian brutes who thought their size gave them the right to push everyone else around. They were easily 8 feet tall, all muscle and teeth, with rough gray skin and yellow eyes that glowed in the dim light. One of them held an electric prod, jabbing it toward the smallest creature and laughing when it squeaked in pain. Something hot and angry flared up in Jake's chest. He had seen enough bullies in his life. He had been pushed around plenty of times back on Earth. But seeing these massive creatures torment something so small and helpless made his blood boil. Hey! The word came out of his mouth before his brain had time to tell him what a terrible idea this was. Leave them alone. All 3 Grullions turned to look at him. The one with the electric prod grinned, showing rows of sharp teeth. Well. Look what crawled out of the sewers, he said in rough galactic common. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together. A human? This doesn't concern you, little mammal? Go back to your hole. The other 2 laughed. One of them kicked at the small creatures, making them huddle even tighter together. Jake's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to walk forward. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't some hero from the stories. He was just a maintenance worker who fixed broken pipes and cleaned air filters. But he couldn't just walk away. I said leave them alone. Jake's voice was steadier than he felt. The Grullions looked at each other and laughed harder. You going to make us human? You're barely worth the effort of stepping on. Jake knew he couldn't fight them. He had seen Grullions bend steel bars with their bare hands. But he didn't need to fight them. He just needed to outsmart them. His eyes darted around the alley, looking for anything he could use. Then he saw it. The cargo panel on the wall, right next to a stack of shipping containers. He grabbed the heavy wrench from his tool belt and swung it hard against the panel's emergency release. The metal clanged loud enough to echo through the alley. Immediately, alarms started blaring. Red lights flashed. The automated cargo system roared to life, and the shipping containers started moving on their magnetic rails. The Grullions jumped back, startled and confused. One of them shouted something Jake couldn't hear over the noise. Jake didn't waste a second. He rushed forward, dropped to his knees and scooped up all 3 of the small creatures. They were warm in his arms, trembling like leaves in a storm. Their scales felt smooth and cool against his skin. Time to go, Jake muttered and ran. He ducked into the maintenance hatch he knew so well, the one that led into the tunnel system. Behind him he heard angry roaring and heavy footsteps. But the Grullions were too big to follow him into the narrow passages. They didn't know these tunnels like he did. Nobody did. Jake ran through the darkness, following paths he had walked 1,000 times. Left at the junction, down 2 levels, through the steam pipe corridor, and finally to the small door that led to his quarters. His room was tiny. Just a bed, a locker, a small table, and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. But it was his, and right now it was safe. He laid the 3 creatures gently on his bed. They were still shaking, their scales pulsing with soft light like tiny heartbeats. Their eyes were huge and dark, filled with intelligence that surprised him. They looked up at Jake with something he recognized. Gratitude. One of them made a soft chirping sound, almost like a bird. The other 2 responded with their own chirps. Jake sat down on the floor, his adrenaline finally wearing off. His hands were shaking now and he felt exhausted. "What am I getting myself into?" he said out loud. But even as he said it, he was already reaching for his water bottle and the leftover food in his locker. The creatures watched him with those big trusting eyes. Jake Morrison might have been nobody special. But tonight, for these 3 little lives, he was everything. 3 days had passed since that night in the alley, and Jake's life had become something he never expected. The 3 small creatures had taken over his tiny quarters, and honestly, he didn't mind one bit. He had named them on the second morning. The one with red and orange swirls in her eyes became Cinder. The one with bright yellow and gold became Blaze. And the smallest one with silver and white flashes became Flash. They seemed to recognize their names almost immediately, chirping and tilting their heads whenever he called them. Their intelligence shocked him. On the first day when Jake had to leave for his shift, he told them to stay quiet and hide under the bed if anyone came to the door. He didn't really expect them to understand. But when he got back that evening, he found all 3 tucked safely beneath the bed frame, silent as stones. They had understood every word. By the second day they were following simple commands. Come here, and they would scurry over to him. Hide, and they would find cover. Quiet, and they would stop their chirping immediately. It was like living with 3 very small, very intelligent children who just happened to have scales and wings. Flash, the smallest, had taken a particular liking to Jake's toolbox. She would watch him work on his equipment in the evenings, her head tilting back and forth as he tightened bolts or cleaned components. Once, when Jake dropped a small screwdriver, Flash picked it up in her tiny claws and brought it back to him. Jake nearly fell off his chair in surprise. Cinder was the protective one. Whenever there were footsteps in the hallway outside, she would position herself between the door and her siblings, her scales brightening with an inner glow. Blaze was the curious one, always exploring every corner of Jake's small room, investigating his belongings with gentle touches of her snout. Jake found himself talking to them constantly. He told them about his day, about the broken water pump on level 7, about how his supervisor was always in a bad mood. They would listen, making soft sounds like they were responding to his stories. It felt less lonely than his life had been before. But while Jake's quarters felt warmer and fuller, the city outside had become cold and tense. On the second day, Jake noticed guards at the tunnel entrance when he left for work. They were checking identification cards and scanning everyone who passed. He had tucked all 3 creatures into his tool bag, covered with a dirty rag. His heart hammered as the guard's scanner passed over his bag, but it only beeped once before letting him through. The creatures had stayed perfectly still and silent. By the 3rd day there were checkpoints everywhere. Armed security stood on street corners that had been empty before. Flying patrol drones buzzed overhead, scanning the crowds below. The usual noise and chaos of the markets had died down to nervous whispers. Jake kept his head down and his ears open. That was how he survived in places like this. Listen more than you talk. Pay attention to what people aren't saying as much as what they are. At lunch on the 3rd day, he sat in the workers' cafeteria with his usual meal of synthetic protein and grain paste. His co-worker, Tommy Blake, dropped into the seat across from him with a heavy sigh. Tommy was a good guy, another human who worked the maintenance circuits on the west side. This city's gone crazy, man, Tommy said, stabbing at his food with his fork. You see all those guards everywhere? Jake nodded, trying to look casual. Yeah. What's going on? Tommy leaned in closer, lowering his voice. You hear about the matriarch? The big dragon who runs this whole place. Jake had heard of her. Everyone had. The matriarch was ancient and powerful, the ruler of Velthara for longer than most species had been exploring space. She was more legend than reality to workers like Jake. The kind of being you never expected to encounter in your lifetime. What about her? Jake asked, though his stomach was starting to twist into knots. She's tearing the city apart looking for something, Tommy said. Nobody knows exactly what, but it's big. Real big. They've got every security force on full alert. I heard they're searching every building, every residence. They say whatever's missing, if it's not found soon, heads are gonna roll. Literally. Jake felt the blood drain from his face. His tool bag sat at his feet and he could feel a slight movement inside. Cinder was shifting position. They say what went missing? He managed to ask. Tommy shrugged. Nobody's talking. It's all classified. But whatever it is, the matriarch wants it back bad enough to lock down a city of 20 million beings. Jake couldn't eat another bite. He mumbled something about needing to get back to work early and left Tommy sitting alone. His hands shook as he carried his tool bag back toward the tunnels. That evening, after his shift ended and he was safely back in his quarters with the three creatures playing on his bed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He needed to know what was happening in the city. He needed to understand the danger he might be in. Jake turned on his old data terminal and accessed the maintenance database. Workers like him had limited access to city networks, but he could at least pull up public news feeds and official bulletins. He started searching, typing in keywords about the lockdown and the matriarch. What he found made his blood turn to ice. The first bulletin had been posted 3 days ago. The same night he rescued the creatures from the alley. It showed an official city seal at the top and below it in bold letters, "Missing royal heirs. Reward for safe return." Below the text were 3 images. 3 small creatures with shimmering scales, tiny wings and intelligent eyes. The images could have been photographs of Cinder, Blaze and Flash. Jake's mouth went dry. He looked over at his bed where all 3 creatures were now watching him curiously. Flash chirped softly, sensing his distress. "Oh no," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're not just dragons. You're the dragons. The royal heirs. The children of the matriarch herself." He had been hiding the most important beings in the entire city in his tiny maintenance workers' quarters, feeding them his leftover rations, letting them sleep in his bed. Jake put his head in his hands. What had he gotten himself into? Jake stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The smart thing to do would be to contact the authorities right now. Turn in the 3 royal heirs, collect whatever reward they were offering, and go back to his normal life. That was the logical choice. The safe choice. But when he looked over at his bed, he saw 3 pairs of eyes staring back at him. Cinder, Blaze and Flash had stopped playing. They sat perfectly still, watching him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. It was like they knew what he had just discovered. Like they were waiting to see what he would do. Jake stood up and walked over to them slowly. He sat down on the edge of the bed and immediately all 3 creatures pressed against him. Cinder nuzzled into his side. Flash climbed onto his lap. Blaze rested her small head against his arm. "I should take you back," Jake said quietly. "Your mother is looking for you. The whole city is turned upside down." Cinder made a soft whimpering sound. Not the happy chirps he had gotten used to over the past 3 days. This was the same terrified whimper he had heard in the alley. That's when Jake noticed something strange. Every time there were heavy footsteps in the hallway outside his door, the 3 creatures would freeze. Their scales would dim. They would shake with fear. And it wasn't just any footsteps. It was specifically when the guards passed by on their patrols. Jake had assumed they were just scared of loud noises or strangers. But now he was starting to wonder. Why would the matriarch's own children be terrified of her guards? Shouldn't they feel safe around the very people sent to find them and bring them home? Something didn't add up. Jake gently moved the creatures aside and went back to his terminal. His maintenance clearance gave him access to city systems that regular citizens couldn't reach. He could pull up building schematics, power grid data, and environmental controls. But he also had limited access to security systems for maintenance purposes. Sometimes cameras broke down. Sometimes footage needed to be reviewed to find what caused a pipe burst or electrical fire. He started digging through the security archives, searching for footage from 3 nights ago. The night he found them in the alley. His fingers flew over the keys as he navigated through directories and file systems he had learned to access over 2 years of fixing things the city didn't want to stay broken. At first he found nothing. The footage from that sector had been wiped clean. But Jake knew that nothing was ever truly deleted in a digital system. There were always backups. Always ghost files hiding in forgotten corners of servers. It took him 2 hours, but he finally found it. Recovered footage from a backup server that ran automatically every 6 hours. The timestamp showed the alley, the exact location where he had found the 3 creatures. Jake's hands shook as he watched the video play. There were the 3 Grullions. The same ones who had been tormenting Cinder, Blaze and Flash. But as Jake watched more carefully, he noticed details he had missed in the chaos of that moment. The Grullions weren't just random thugs. Under their rough civilian clothes, he could see the edges of military-grade armor. Combat gear that only high-level security forces had access to. Jake paused the video and zoomed in. One of them was carrying a device on his belt. Jake recognized it from his training manuals. It was a signal jammer. The kind used to block tracking devices and communication signals. Why would street bullies have military jamming equipment? Jake's stomach churned as he continued watching. The footage showed the Grullians herding the small dragons into the alley, deliberately cornering them. This wasn't random cruelty. This was planned. Coordinated. He fast-forwarded through more footage, checking other cameras in the area. He found another clip from 30 minutes before the alley incident. It showed the three small dragons wandering near the royal district, playing together without a care. Then the Grullians appeared, using some kind of device that made the creatures follow them. They were being lured away. Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. This wasn't a kidnapping where someone wanted to ransom the heirs or use them as leverage. If that was the plan, they would have taken them somewhere secure. Hidden them. No, these Grullians were trying to kill them. And they had been using jamming equipment to block whatever tracking signals the royal family must have placed on the children. The pieces fell into place in Jake's mind like a puzzle he didn't want to solve. This was an assassination attempt. Someone wanted the matriarch's heirs dead. And now, with the whole city on lockdown and guards everywhere, the assassins had the perfect cover to finish what they started. They could search anywhere, go anywhere, all under the guise of looking for the missing heirs. Jake's blood ran cold. If he turned the creatures into the wrong guards, they would die. And he would probably die right alongside them for knowing too much. But who could he trust? How could he tell which guards were loyal and which ones were part of the conspiracy? The Grullians clearly had inside help. They had military equipment. They had known where the heirs would be. They had access to delete security footage. This went high up. Maybe very high up. Jake looked back at the three small creatures on his bed. They were depending on him. In the entire massive city of Velthara, filled with millions of beings from hundreds of worlds, he was the only one who stood between them and death. "I'll figure something out," Jake promised them. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Cinder chirped softly, and the other two echoed her sound. It almost sounded like trust. Jake turned back to his terminal, planning to dig deeper into the files to find more evidence, to figure out who was behind this. He needed a plan. That's when he heard the heavy footsteps in the hallway. Coming closer. Stopping right outside his door. Jake barely had time to stand up before his door exploded inward in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. Three massive figures filled the doorway, backlit by the hallway lights. Jake recognized them immediately. The Grullians from the alley had found him. The leader stepped through the smoking doorway, his yellow eyes locked on Jake. "Give us the brats, human," he snarled, his voice dripping with menace. It was the same Grullian from the alley, and he looked even more dangerous now. The other two flanked him on either side, both holding energy weapons that hummed with deadly power. Jake didn't think. Thinking would have frozen him in place. Instead, his body moved on pure instinct. He lunged for his tool bag on the floor, scooping it up with one hand. He felt the weight of the three creatures inside, heard their frightened chirps. With his other hand, he grabbed the edge of his bed and yanked it sideways, throwing it into the path of the Grullians. It bought him maybe 2 seconds. But 2 seconds was all he needed. Jake dove for the small maintenance hatch in the corner of his room. The one he used when the air filtration system in this section needed repairs. His fingers found the release handle and twisted hard. The hatch popped open with a hiss of pressurized air. Behind him, he heard the Grullians shoving his bed aside like it weighed nothing. "Stop him." Jake threw himself through the hatch, landing hard on the metal grating on the other side. Pain shot through his shoulder, but he didn't stop moving. He kicked the hatch closed behind him and spun the emergency lock. It wouldn't hold them for long, but every second counted. The maintenance tunnel stretched out before him in both directions, lit only by dim emergency lights. Jake ran to the right, his boots clanging on the metal floor. The tool bag bounced against his side and he held it tight against his chest with both arms. He could feel Cinder, Blaze, and Flash moving inside, their small bodies pressed together in fear. "It's okay," Jake gasped, even though nothing about this was okay. "I've got you." Behind him, the hatch exploded outward. The Grullians were coming. Sirens began wailing throughout the tunnel system. The security breach had triggered automatic alarms. Red lights flashed along the walls, turning everything into a nightmare of shadows and crimson glare. Jake ran harder than he had ever run in his life. His lungs burned. His legs screamed at him to stop. But he kept going because stopping meant death. For him and for the 3 small lives he carried. He knew these tunnels. He had spent 2 years crawling through every pipe, every shaft, every corridor of this section. The Grullians were bigger and stronger, but they didn't have his knowledge. He just had to stay ahead of them long enough to figure out a plan. Energy blasts scorched the walls beside him, leaving smoking black marks on the metal. The Grullians were shooting at him now. Jake zigged to the left, then zagged to the right, making himself a harder target. A blast hit the ceiling above him, showering him with hot sparks. Jake's mind raced as fast as his feet. Where could he go? Where would be safe? Every exit would have guards now. Every tunnel would be searched. But maybe that was exactly what he needed to do. Get somewhere public. Somewhere with witnesses. They couldn't kill him in front of a crowd, could they? He took a sharp left turn into a steam vent corridor. Scalding hot vapor filled the narrow space, making it hard to see or breathe. But Jake knew this path. He had fixed a leak here just last week. He ran through the steam, ignoring the heat that made his skin feel like it was on fire. The Grullians behind him weren't so lucky. He heard them cursing and coughing in the steam. It bought him a few more precious seconds. Jake burst out of the steam corridor and hit the emergency release on a bulkhead door. The heavy metal barrier slammed down behind him with a boom that echoed through the tunnels. The Grullians would have to go around or break through. Either way, he had bought himself time. But he was getting tired. His legs felt like rubber. His shoulder throbbed where he had landed on it. The tool bag with the 3 dragons seemed to grow heavier with each step. Or maybe that was just exhaustion making everything harder. Jake found a ladder and started climbing. Up and up, level after level. His arms burned with the effort. Below him, he heard the Grullians smashing through the bulkhead door. They were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. He climbed until he reached the industrial sector, high above the residential levels. This was where the city's main power systems ran. Massive conduits carried energy to every part of Velthara. The air hummed with electricity, and the floor vibrated with the pulse of generators the size of buildings. Jake stumbled out onto a catwalk that stretched across a huge open space. Below him, thousands of feet down, he could see the glowing core of the main power reactor. The heat rising from it made the air shimmer. He was trapped. The catwalk only led in one direction, and there was nowhere else to go. The 3 Grullians emerged from the access tunnel behind him. They walked slowly now, taking their time. Their weapons were raised, but they weren't shooting anymore. They didn't need to rush. They had him cornered. Nowhere to run, maintenance man, the leader said, his voice echoing across the vast chamber. Should have minded your own business. Jake backed up until he felt the railing behind him. His hands shook. His whole body shook. This was it. After everything, this was how it ended. But then he felt movement in the tool bag. Cinder, Blaze, and Flash crawled out, their small claws gripping the fabric. They positioned themselves between Jake and the approaching Grullians, their scales beginning to glow brighter than he had ever seen. A fierce, protective light. Tiny jets of flame sparked from their mouths. Not enough to hurt the Grullians, but enough to show their defiance. They were protecting him just as he had protected them. Something broke inside Jake's chest. Not fear. Something else. Something stronger. His hand reached out and found cold metal on the wall beside him. An emergency terminal. The kind he had seen 100 times in his work but had never needed to use. It was a direct link to City Central Command. To the throne room itself. With the last bit of strength in his exhausted body, Jake slammed his palm down on the activation beacon. Every light in the entire city of Velthara turned red. The emergency beacon sent out a pulse that rippled through every system in Velthara. Alarms screamed. Every screen in the city flashed red. Every communication channel was overridden with a single message. Emergency at Power Core 7. All systems redirected. The 3 Grullians froze, their eyes wide with sudden fear. The leader raised his weapon toward Jake one last time, but before he could fire, the world exploded. The wall to Jake's left simply ceased to exist. Metal and concrete vaporized in a blast of heat and force that knocked everyone to their knees. Through the massive hole in the structure, something enormous moved through the sky. She arrived like a storm-given form. The dragon that flew through the shattered wall was the size of a small building. Her scales shimmered in patterns of ancient silver and gold, each one catching the light like a mirror reflecting the dawn of time itself. Her wings stretched wider than the catwalk was long, creating gusts of wind that made the entire structure shake. Her eyes burned with a fury that made looking at them feel like staring into the heart of a sun. The matriarch sovereign had arrived, and the air itself trembled in her presence. The temperature in the chamber rose 20 degrees in seconds. Jake felt the heat radiating off her like standing too close to a furnace. But it wasn't just heat. It was power. Raw, ancient, terrifying power that made every instinct in his body scream at him to run. The three Grullions tried to do exactly that. They turned and ran for the access tunnel, their weapons forgotten, their assassination plan abandoned. All they wanted now was to escape. They didn't make it 3 steps. The matriarch moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something so large. One moment she was hovering outside the broken wall. The next moment she had landed on the catwalk between Jake and the fleeing assassins. The metal groaned under her weight but held. Jake didn't see exactly what happened to the Grullions. He was too busy collapsing against the railing, his legs finally giving out after carrying him through the longest run of his life. His vision was blurring at the edges. His lungs couldn't seem to pull in enough air. His whole body felt like it was shutting down. But he felt small claws on his chest. Cinder, Blaze, and Flash had crawled onto him, pressing their small bodies against his heart. They were chirping desperately, their voices high and frightened. Not for themselves this time. For him. Jake tried to tell them he was okay, but his mouth wouldn't form the words. The world was spinning. The red lights were fading to black. The last thing he heard before everything went dark was a voice like thunder mixed with music, speaking words he couldn't quite understand. When Jake woke up, he thought he might be dead. The room around him was made of crystal that caught light and split it into 1,000 colors. Everything was soft and quiet. Medical equipment hummed somewhere nearby, but it was gentle, not the harsh beeping of the hospital wards he knew from Earth. He was lying in the most comfortable bed he had ever felt. His body didn't hurt anymore. The exhaustion was gone. Even his old shoulder injury from years ago, the one that always ached when it rained, felt perfectly fine. Jake tried to sit up and managed it without any pain. That's when he saw her. At the foot of his bed stood a dragon, but not the massive creature from the power core. This form was smaller, barely 10 feet tall, though her presence still filled the room completely. Her scales were the same ancient silver and gold, and her eyes held that same burning intensity. But now Jake could meet her gaze without feeling like his soul might catch fire. "You saved my children," the matriarch sovereign said. Her voice resonated through the room like a bell made of thunder and music combined. Each word felt like it carried the weight of centuries. "You risked everything for beings you didn't know. You protected them when the entire city had failed to do so." Jake's mouth was dry. He tried to speak and had to clear his throat twice before words came out. "They needed help," he finally managed to say. That's all that mattered. He tried to sit up straighter and winced despite the lack of pain. The matriarch's eyes softened slightly. "The conspirators have been dealt with," she said. "The corruption in my guard has been burned out. My children are safe because of you, Jake Morrison. A human maintenance worker who had nothing to gain and everything to lose." The matriarch moved closer, and Jake had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. "I can give you wealth beyond measure," she said. "Power. Status. A position high in my court. Name anything you desire, and it is yours." Jake thought about it. Really thought about it. He could ask for money. Enough money to never work again. He could ask for a ship of his own to travel the galaxy. He could ask to go home to Earth in luxury. But that wasn't what mattered. "Better working conditions," Jake said quietly. "For people like me. The maintenance workers, the janitors, the low-level folks who keep this city running. Fair wages. Safety regulations that actually get enforced, not just written down and ignored." He paused, then added, "And maybe, if it's okay, I could visit them sometimes? Cinder, Blaze, and Flash, I mean. I'd like to know they're doing all right." The room fell completely silent. Then the matriarch laughed. It was a sound like rolling thunder across distant mountains, like wind chimes made of stars. "You ask for nothing for yourself," she said, and there was something in her voice that might have been wonder. How very human. She leaned closer until her massive head was level with Jake's. "You have my protection, Jake Morrison. And more than that, you have my respect. Few beings in this galaxy can claim such a thing. Fewer still have earned it the way you have." 6 months passed like a dream Jake couldn't quite believe was real. He sat now in the royal gardens, a place he never would have imagined visiting, let alone being welcome in. The gardens stretched for acres, filled with plants from 100 different worlds. Water fountains sparkled in the sunlight. And playing in those fountains were 3 dragons who were no longer the size of house cats. Cinder, Blaze, and Flash had grown. They were now the size of horses, their scales even more magnificent, their wings strong enough to carry them into the sky. But when they saw Jake walking toward them, they rushed over with the same excited chirps they had made when they were small enough to fit in his tool bag. Jake laughed as Flash nearly knocked him over with enthusiasm, water dripping from her silver scales. Cinder and Blaze crowded in for attention, and for a moment he was just a guy playing with his friends. Not Jake Morrison, labor advisor to the matriarch. Not the human who had reshaped working conditions across an entire alien city. Just Jake. Other aliens walked past the gardens and he saw them watching. Some with curiosity. Some with respect. Some with wonder. The human who had earned a dragon's favor, not through strength or cunning or manipulation, but through simple kindness. Jake scratched behind Cinder's ears the way she liked, watching Blaze and Flash chase each other through the fountain spray. That, he thought with a smile, was the most human thing of all. To see something helpless and small, to see something that needed protection, and to help simply because it was the right thing to do. Not for reward. Not for recognition. Just because someone needed help and he had been there to give it. The end.